Hi everybody, this is Anthony Scullenbritty from Everyday Commentary, and this is a video overview of this knife. And this knife is the Lionsteel Roundhead. The Lionsteel Roundhead is a knife that was produced by Collector's Knives, made by Lionsteel. It came in 4 different handle materials. This one is obviously carbon fiber. They had one that was smooth bone or something to that effect. They had a stag, and then they had an abalone, and the abalone is really beautiful. And the last I checked, the only one that was left was the abalone. That's because the abalone was like $100 more. This knife actually was available for pre-order, and it wasn't terribly expensive. It was around $100, $120, and then for this version, and it went up for the other natural handled materials. And so this is basically Lionsteel's take on an quintessential American knife, the Barlow. And the Barlow was a knife that has been around for a very long time. It was mentioned by name in Huck Finn and in Tom Sawyer. It is a knife that has a very interesting origin story that I'll probably get into sometime in the future. And basically, it was a traditional knife. And it had this extra long bolster here. And the purpose of the extra long bolster was to do exactly what bolsters were originally designed to do, which was to bolster or strengthen the pivot. As modern manufacturing has gotten better and materials have gotten better, the need to actually bolster the pivot is no longer there. But the form was so classic that it's remained. And so the first thing that you have is this, usually it's 2/5. It's a 2/5 bolster, so it takes up 2/5 of the handle scale. And then the other part was you had this rounded sort of teardrop shape at the bottom, and it really gives you a nice grip in the hand. It's not something that will ever cause any hot spots. This knife is a little different, not only because it's made by an Italian company and it uses modern materials, but it also uses a modern blade steel. So this is a slip joint, as you can see. And it's a two-handed open. It has a nail neck. But let's see if we can get the camera to focus right there. Yep. So there you go. This knife runs M390 steel, which is probably some of the nicest blade steel you'll ever find on a Barlow. The knife has a bunch of really nice touches, like you can see here. So it has a swedge here, but right here you can see that the spine is crowned. That means it's rounded over. And that rounding motif is carried over here on the back spring. So the slip joint back spring is this portion right here, and it just basically presses like a hammer or a tip down into a slot on the back of the knife and holds the knife open, but it doesn't lock it in place. So the back spring is crowned as well, which gives it a really nice look. It's very different than what you would get on a normal traditional knife, where it's sort of flush with the back. And then you can see here that the inner liners are rounded, and that the scales and then the covers themselves are also pretty substantially rounded. So this is a very, very round, comfortable knife in the hand, and that's probably why it got the name the Roundhead. I like the blade. I like the blade steel, but there are a couple of weird things about the knife. If you notice, this knife has 4 screws on each side, and all they're doing is holding these 2 cover materials in place. By the way, I think that the liners in this portion are titanium, but it's totally unnecessary. There's really no reason for them to do this. They could do this without it. The other thing that I really don't like here is this exposed hang. And yes, it is something that is traditional in Barlows to have an exposed hang, but this is not a traditional knife. This is a knife that uses a traditional pattern with lots of modern touches. So they could have totally, quite simply, got this to go down. One of the things that I noticed is that this screw, I don't believe, is the pivot screw for the knife. So if the pivot screw is actually under this bolster, they could have moved the pivot screw from like right here down a little, and that would have brought this edge, this corner down as well. And like if you think about it, that's something that happens quite a bit. There are a lot of knife companies that do that, and in fact, one of them that did that makes a very traditional knife, and this is probably my favorite traditional knife I've owned. It's probably one of my favorite traditional knives I've ever handled. It is the Canal Street Cutlery Boy's Knife, which is essentially a small version of the Barlow. And as you can see, this knife has almost no exposed rear tang because they did exactly what I said, and they moved the pivot screw way down there. You can see that there are 3 pins on this knife, but there's no screws, and there's no screw head in the bolsters, and there's no pin in the bolsters. So in many ways, this is a much more traditional knife. It runs 440C steel. It has a very traditional look and feel. It's made by a company that makes made almost exclusively traditional knives, and yet it has more modern features other than the steel and the cover material than this knife here. And so I'm not exactly sure how well I'm going to like this knife. I'm not sure what it's going to score, but I'm going to give it a carry and see what I feel like it's worth, and then I'll put up a review. The other thing is this knife comes with a really classy little leather sheath. A little slip, so you know it's sort of Nundy-esque in that regard. You just slide it in there, and there you go. A couple of things that are strange, in addition to the things I already pointed out. This is a really, 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 really skinny, long knife. This also almost looks like what is traditionally called a fruit tester's knife, which was a knife that basically had a very thin, very long 5 or 6 inch blade, and the idea was you could open it up and sort of pierce a melon and figure out whether or not the melon was fresh, and you could go all the way to the center with the really long blade, even on a big melon. I've handled a couple of fruit knives. They make excellent, obviously, fruit prep knives, but this knife is just so long. I mean, if you look at that and then you compare it to something like the boy's knife, you're going to see a huge difference. I mean, just a massive difference. I mean, look, I'll put them on the same plane so you can see, like, lay one on top of the other, see if that'll work. But, like, that's a much bigger knife. It's a much bigger blade. It's a much bigger knife. And, frankly, I don't think you really need all that length in a traditional style knife. But the materials are good. You know, like Lionsteel does a good job with fit and finish. They always have. The materials are good. It's just there's a little bit of quirk to it. Some things I don't like, but it's certainly not a bad knife. There's no way it's a bad knife. And in the slip, when you throw the slip in your pocket, that's a pretty classy setup. So that's a video overview of the Collector's Knives Lionsteel Roundhead. And by the way, I think they're all sold out except for the abalone, if I didn't say that already. Look for a review coming soon.